Now straight into our next part of the show, where the means of generating funds for electoral purposes is at the moment of supreme concern to those who believe that the unwholesome influence of money has been the source of poor political leadership in Nigeria. In simple terms, the ability of dubious politicians to successfully buy off potential voters would have to be neutralized for the 2023 general election to serve the overall interest of Nigerians. Fisayo Olusegun is a lawyer and public affairs advocate, and he joins us now to discuss the subject. Good day and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me again.
Now, straight to the crux of the matter. You know, we talk about vote buying, we talk about the receipt or the use of suspicious funds by politicians. How enforceable are all of these electoral acts?
It's an ongoing challenge, actually. I think the problem even emanates from the Electoral Act as well, because the structure of electoral funding in Nigeria is such that the party has its own funding, and then the candidate themselves have their own means of, raising funds. It seems that, the Electoral Act, commingles the obligation on the party as separate from the obligation on the candidate. And in actual sense, it should be one of the same thing. So the cap on electoral expense, for instance, under Section 88 was imposed on the candidate, right? Meanwhile, every other regulatory responsibility is that of the party. So at what point do you determine what? So yes, I agree with you, it's a cause for huge concern because the party and the candidate should be put under the same window for the purpose of, looking at the sources of their funding and all that. So I think the even more important one is the candidate himself. Because if a candidate has access to limitless funds, then it's just natural that they will want to exploit those funds in compelling electorate. So yes, it's a source of concern.
The foreign, and I definitely see reason with the aspect of not accepting funds from foreign sources. But when it comes to well-wishers, for instance, where a party puts out their account details and asks supporters to donate or whatever to fund their own movement, do you see anything wrong with that? Do you think that's something that INEC should be checking or saying that it should be, dissuaded?
Well, from what I gather, the people who have pioneered funding of elections abroad are Nigerians who are in the diaspora. And from that perspective, if a Nigerian lives elsewhere, separate from Nigeria, I don't think that bars them from contributing to the process, the election process. So if someone living in the US or in Europe wants to contribute funds to any of the candidates, in the face of it, I don't see anything wrong in that. But the problem is where, what you call in the US bundling, where a group of people are coming together and the funds are quite significant. It's up to INEC and all other regulatory bodies to take another view of it, Because if it's elections, you just need to be careful, the kind of funds you allow people to have.
I hear you on that, maybe because I mentioned foreign. I'm talking about domestic donations, whereby a party puts out their information. Do you see any problem with where people locally in Nigeria are donating or putting funds together?
I don't.
So, because INEC has made it clear that there are, anonymous donation is something that is not allowed or goes against the provisions of, I think it's Section 95(2) and 3. Thereabout. I'm not sure if that was the exact excerpt, but they have made it clear that that's not something that sits well with them. So do you think that's an issue?
Well, I think that question solves itself. When you say something's anonymous, it means you can't trace it to anybody. It may well be funds coming from illegal activities or, something, a bit more, unlawful. So if someone wants to donate money to any movement, you should be able to put a face behind the funds. So yes, I agree with INEC there, that if you want to make a donation and you call it anonymous, it raises more suspicion and concern, and legitimately so.
Now, crowdfunding has obviously become a huge phenomenon globally. I believe it was a lot more informal before, and a lot less structured. And now we see there's various digital platforms, various avenues where people can be accountable and where people can be identified in order to contribute. So where do we draw the line with this, right? Because again, as much as we can use some of these popular crowdfunding campaigns, you can't always verify your identity. You can always create an account on those. So are we just going to draw the line? Because if you look at the 2015 presidential election, there was a lot of crowdfunding for President Buhari's campaign. So where do we draw the line in this conversation? Because it seems, some are more equal than others where the rule of these laws applies.
All right. For one, I believe that technology sits at the middle of the possible solution of a lot of our problems as a country, and even globally, right? You see, the caution is that mediums like crowdfunding gives you at least somewhat legitimate alternative, because if you don't give the candidates, if you don't give the system the opportunity to raise funds, they will raise it anyway, and it will happen. So if you have an option to use, globally accepted, mediums, everybody crowdfunds these days, so I think it's something INEC should have another look at. And, because for me, I think INEC has not been on the same page, perhaps with the realities of the candidate. The cap of 5 billion presidential does not make sense, for instance. Private jets, accommodation with all the retinue, that in itself, throughout the course of campaign, you could almost burn half of that, or even more. So what are we talking about? All through 36 states and the Federal Capital Territory. That's a lot of money. So I think the task on INEC now is to be a lot more inclusive of the realities around the parties. It's Nigeria where we're big. So those kind of realities should come in regulated, because if you make laws that are not realistic, you won't be able to enforce them. It won't make sense.
Morally, though, or rather ethically speaking, where do we draw the line? Because you look at groups like Not Too Young to Run, for example, and one of their primary arguments is that, well, if you make it this expensive, how will the young people participate? So where do we draw the line? Because it is supposed to level out barriers of entry. But if you look at the United States, for example, you're going to need at least, a few $1 million before you can even think about wanting to declare for presidency. But for our environment here, in the spirit of trying to include more young people, include more ethnicities, more religions, and so forth, should we really be looking at INEC increasing that cap that's sitting at 5 billion for presidential, 100 million for governorship, 70 million for House of Reps? As you've said, when you look at election spending, this is nothing to election spending, of course. So
my concern is about stakes. Right? We're talking about the presidency of Nigeria here, plus or minus trillions of naira. And we're talking 5 billion here. So if you look at the stakes, right, you want to make sure that you're close to reality as possible, right? With everything gone up, we all live in Nigeria and we see what's happened. My point is not even on the figures, it's on the point that, look, just make sure you're close to their reality as possible. Do you understand? If they will need minimum of 15 billion for, the campaigns, don't limit them to 5 billion, or else they will find ways around it. And you won't be able to enforce your laws because they're big. Right now, we have enforcement issues where even from the last elections, there are returns that have not been rendered by most political parties. There's nothing INEC can do about it. And when you have a law that can be enforced, that law becomes redundant. Becomes
more nominal than...
Absolutely. So the caution is make sure your regulations reflect as much reality as possible.
Now, I want to shift focus just a little bit, from the issue of funding. Is INEC, from your perspective, is INEC doing everything that it should right now ahead of the elections? And I want to, that's the premise to my question, in the sense that it's starting to appear as though they're focusing on some aspects at the detriment of others. For instance, we're not hearing anything about any debates. We're not hearing anything about the fact that the electoral body we haven't seen any significant thing when it comes to the electoral body addressing the suggestions that it has been compromised. We're not, and there's even a case where in Benue State where someone plans to actually, take the electoral body to court because, from what we understand here, his name was erroneously recorded twice against NNPP and Labour Party when he's contesting to be a lawmaker representing the Gwer East and West federal constituency. So we see errors like this. So I'm just wondering, is INEC focusing on things like, funding issues and not addressing issues that are just as important, like what I just mentioned, from your perspective?
For me, in fairness, in terms of visibility of what INEC is doing, campaigns just started. So I will cut them a bit of slack. They should do a lot more house guiding, from the back end and let the parties, roll out their activities. But I must also say that the build up to these elections, a lot seem to have been addressed compared to the earlier elections, if you know what I mean, from the primaries and, how the primaries were conducted, consensus party, direct primaries, indirect, because it's all about governance at every level, and I think a lot more attention has been put on those things. It's a learning curve. There's no perfect elections anywhere in the world. How quickly you learn from the mistakes. There will be technology challenges. You can recall that the technology around, the card readers is improving, then the last minute pressure about issuing our voters card and all that. So there will certainly be, learning curves and whatnot. But so far, for me, I will say that INEC should try and be collaborative of other agencies as well. So they shouldn't do it alone. Because when we're talking about elections, that is the most important activity to our democracy. So we all can't just leave it to INEC. Every agency needs to support. For instance, we're looking at funding of elections, and INEC, for instance, should work with other law enforcement agencies to just profile people and see more. Because INEC can't do the work of, say, an EFCC, for instance, in terms of money laundering and whatnot. You need to focus on the core technology, voting, registration, and all that. So it's a range of things, and I think INEC is trying. There will be moments, to learn and to quickly, fix, the process again. But in the build-up to this, I think the major concern now is, for instance, we've not had this kind of concern on funding before. Funding the way we are looking at it now, because if these guys have access to bullion vans, then how then can you control anybody? That's the point. So what we're saying is level playing field. If you are popular and if your ideology is right, we want it to resonate with the people and let it result in, electoral victory. Not on the other hand, you having enough cash chest, so that you can literally undermine a whole country. So I think that's the point we're making, that INEC should be more inclusive of this process. You focus on the party, focus also on the candidate. Because when it comes to election, the candidate at a point takes it over. So I will say give a bit even more attention to the candidate, maybe 60% to the candidate and the party, because they fund the election.
Intrinsically, what does that look like? Because, earlier you did mention that one of the biggest issues, or rather concerns, with the Electoral Act is that there is a focus on holding the candidate accountable, and the party almost gets away with whatever may have happened. And one thing we do see consistently is the party structures. If there's anything that changes more than the weather in Nigeria, is probably party structures, right? So that's a massive loophole, because there's a change within the party, and all of a sudden a whole group of people get away with, with irresponsible behavior. A new group come in and the party still stands. So intrinsically in the Electoral Act, what can really be done so that that loophole can be plugged?
For me, it's an ongoing concern, and it's not such that, because mind you, INEC is not part of the parties. INEC regulates the parties. So as much as possible, you allow the parties a lot of independence to do whatever they want to do. You're regulating, but you're not part of it. So you allow them do their internal stuff, but you set up the framework, for it. So if a party is prone to change of leadership and personnel, honestly, I don't think there is very little INEC can do to stop that. If within the party people feel that their leadership must change, it ends up in court, there's nothing INEC can do, honestly, about that. But you should set up the framework to make sure that, because it will happen, it's politics. It's about human interest and differences. So it could escalate that where there are smaller parties that have had a problem where they've been in court for literally better part of 3-4 years, and it causes a lot of instability in the party. But I think the admonition to INEC is just to build a framework. It's all about governance. Governance on INEC side, governance on the party's side, and how they deal with their internal issues. Because that is where the seed of, whatever we see on election day comes from. So I would say INEC should focus more on building the framework within those parties. Those personnel changes, those leadership changes, they're inevitable. They will occur.
Now, I still want to go back to the issue of, we've not seen anyone or any party or whatever an example being made out of anyone that's flouted this. The last election, the cap was exceeded. Some provisions of the Constitution talk about not using the incumbent's office to suppress other parties that are contending for, the presidency or other positions of, authority.
Yeah.
And it almost comes across as though this is an advisory as opposed to a mandate, because where is the consequence? So if these are flouted, the funding aspect or the section 95.2 in terms of incumbent suppressing or using or having undue advantage compared to the others, what is in place to have an implementation or to actually make sure that it's followed through? Because what happens?
Okay, so that's part of the statement I made earlier that we all can leave INEC to it. It's too big a risk for it to fail or for it not to be effective. If you have regulations that are out of tune with reality, by nature, people will ignore it, and justifiably so. So you need to be careful to make sure that when laws are put in place, for instance, there have been examples of laws that are bad. They are still laws though, but they're bad. And people ignore them. And it's almost common knowledge, everybody ignores it with that law. But if your law is realistic, it then tends to get the buy-in of everybody, because it's in everybody's interest for laws to be enforced. The stakes at the level of elections in a country like Nigeria is so high that we can't leave it to INEC, and we can't afford INEC to be ignored. If there's an electoral law that awards penalties, you need to enforce it very strictly. But APC is the incumbent right now. The power or the motivation or the drive INEC will have to penalize an APC will be a very interesting one to all of us. But that's where to start from. So those are the host of issues. Because if you have this law, these regulations, these limits, and they're flouted, and I think it's about to happen now, because they will certainly spend more than 5 billion, presidential. Take it from me, they will spend more.
And let's, here's me playing devil's advocate and say, what if we remove all spending limits? Hear me out. You look at the cultural niche, or the cultural nuances, of campaigning and politicking in Nigeria. Well-wishers put up billboards for their candidates. Candidates go to weddings, funerals, and spend lavish amounts of money. All this, it sincerely cannot be documented. As you go, from morning, you look at a politician's home early in the morning. How do you know they're standing for election? Because early in the morning, there's queues of people waiting for handouts. So is it possible, with the same argument that we're using to say that the limit should be realistic, why don't we just say that this is a boost to the economy, this is money being injected to ordinary people, and we should just allow it be as it needs to be?
So
I'm sorry, I'm just playing
it's
devil's advocate.
It's a very good, scenario you had raised, and it's one that must give anybody who is carefully observing our electoral process a good thought. You see, the problem is that people are not just generous to candidates; they're expecting something back. What they're expecting back is likely part of what we all hold together. So there's good sense in trying to insist that you should, as much as possible, create a framework. Because if you want to, recognize that type of expense, it can be recognized. It can be. Because when people queue in front of your houses, you feed them, you give handouts to them and stuff like that, it can be recognized. It can be. And for me, it's also a part where INEC is also on ground to be as close to reality as possible. Because if you expect the candidates or the parties, to be the person that will come and make disclosures to you, that may not be the best approach. They will tell you, I didn't spend anything. But if you have your own independent sources to say, no, we have our own reports that for 3 months you were feeding at least XYZ number of people, so that can check. But it is very important for that kind of expense to be captured. Because everybody funding that, they are waiting for some reward.
I remember, I saw, a picture of a tweet, someone that donated, put his details out there, sent a screenshot, so I'm sure he has expectations.
Absolutely.
So I donated my 10,000 naira.
Absolutely.
I have expexpectations
so
regarding this.
What they've done in the US is that categories of donors from individuals, if you want to donate as an individual, there's a limit. If you want to donate as a group, there's a limit to the size of the group. There's a limit to what the group can donate. And, different categories. So we should recognize all this. So if someone, and billboards are not cheap. So someone wakes up and puts up the largest billboard in Lagos in honor of one of the candidates, right? You see, that's big. And if an INEC can ignore that, because it should come within the frame. I imagine there should be a part of a department, election monitoring department in INEC, should see some level of, spending. And who is this guy? Where is he recorded? Maybe you call it independent, donations. But it must be documented somewhere. You can't just allow anybody to go anywhere and bring in money that we don't know. That's part of the process. So it's a good point to make that, look, people they print t-shirts, for instance. Maybe that's on the lower end. But as these funds get bigger, it's very key for us to create a framework that we can identify them and factor it into this cost.
Besides collaboration, which is what you recommended that the electoral body does to see provisions like this implemented, what else would you recommend INEC considers ahead of the elections to make things relatively smoother besides collaboration?
You see, for me, I think that Nigeria, we have our own peculiar environment, right? I don't think we'll get our elections perfect at a time. And I must be honest, from 2015 to 2019, up until now, the process seemed to be getting better. People are getting more conscious. There's a lot more interest now in voting. You saw the queues with voters' card and all that. So I think that as a process, it's getting better. And INEC is bound within its own laws. So the INEC's capacity to take initiatives with itself is a bit limited to their own laws. You can't take initiatives outside your own laws. So I think your point, for me, it's a larger point. Because the other cycle, 2023, the next cycle is 2027, I believe, right?
Yes.
So, and for any country that is worth its salt, you want to start to prepare. You plan ahead, 10 years, 15 years, a decade, half a decade. So yes, I hear you that, look, INEC needs to be on top. I've told you, INEC should be a lot more inclusive in, not to be part of it, but to have a lot more visibility of what is going on with the parties. Do you understand? So if a party is spending 20 billion and her cap says 5 billion, I think it's an issue that should be addressed. And these plugins from the independent billboard, because also a lot of items can easily be identified as independent donations Meanwhile, it could be coming from the candidate. So that's why I said there should be a framework. Someone can't just go ahead and put up a 20 million naira billboard for a party, and it's just fine. And he just zips into the mid-head. No, that doesn't...
Well wishers.
Yes. So there should be a process where you're on ground enough to recognize those things and try and also let... The parties also should be aware that, INEC is on top of these issues and they can enforce it.
Now, very quickly before we go,
Yes.
Section 92(7) of the 2010 Electoral Act states that, and I'm sure this has been updated, but let's just use this information.
Yes.
Election expenses beyond the limit stipulated in this act commit an offence and is liable on conviction to a maximum fine of 1 million naira, if I'm correct, and forfeiture to the commission of the amount by which expenses exceed the limit set by the commission. Is this a hefty enough penalty? Because, it could be construed as the cost of doing politics. If I know I'm going to exceed by 5 billion, then it's easy for me to just keep these are big figures of money, but to these people, it's nothing. I could just keep another little 5 billion plus 1 million handy in case anything comes my way. Absolutely. Is this enough?
Absolutely. Well, I must say that, you see, like I'd mentioned, INEC is limited by their own laws. INEC do not make those laws. The legislators make the laws. And this election that is coming up next year, whatever INEC will do and the parties will do, the candidates will do, well bound by the Electoral Act. And I don't think we can change it now. It can be amended between now and when the elections will hold. But it's a good point you've made. And my own approach is just not for these elections. Let the elections go on as it is, right? But learn from the mistakes, learn from the flaws, learn from the loopholes. Well, the point you make is a very, very valid point. I personally believe that the people who drafted that law had no picture of the kind of figures they were dealing with, or the kind of monies we're talking about, or chose to ignore it, right? Because certainly they will flout it. So if the penalty is not, it's just a slap on the wrist, so it's fine.
Very well.
So they will factor it.
Very well said. Yes. Wonderful analysis. Fisayo Olusegun, lawyer.
Thank you
so much for joining us on Newsday. We appreciate your time, as always.
Thank you.